The rapid gunfire sounds accompanied the sharp smell of burning gunpowder as it drifted up through the aircraft from the nose section. While scanning the skies, we had failed to notice, as we crested a small hill, that we were practically positioned over the edge of an airfield. Dozens of dual-winged training aircraft lined the field. Herndon informed us later, "I was not going through this mission without firing this weapon, and well, an airport, training field or otherwise, makes a reasonable target." We were now approaching the foothills. I called to Pole. "Keep your eyes alert back there, Pole." "Yes, sir. All clear." Our shadow, which I had observed jumping about on the ground, continually changing shape and size as it passed over small hills and knolls during our approach to the target, was now becoming steadier and smaller beneath us as we began climbing to clear the 6,000 to 8,000-foot mountains which form the backbone of Japan. Here, away from the distinctive structure of buildings and appearance of people, it resembled the mountains east of Seattle. Trees were sparse, however, unlike the wooded Cascades. Mount Fuji reached skyward to our left, and snow dotted the peaks of all the mountains around us. We crossed the peak of the backbone only feet above the scrawny, leafless saplings, and land fell abruptly away under us. Ahead stretched a magnificent view of some 50 miles of flat green land, and on the horizon the silver streak of the Sea of Japan. Pole gave us the "OK, all clear" from his rear observation post as we started our descent down the western slopes of Japan's mountain ridge. "I will wager we are the first B-25 crew of 5 to bomb Tokyo and cross Japan at noon on a Saturday," I remarked, trying to say something humorous to break the tension a little. It did draw a smile from Ski as he answered, and took off from an aircraft carrier called the Hornet. It was approaching the 5-hour mark in flying time since we had departed that floating palace, and I can remember opening another pack of cigarettes as we crossed that low, flat stretch with the mountains behind us now. Somehow, the candy bars we had brought along, a carton of them, did not appeal to us yet. We could have used another load of bombs between the foothills and the sea. We passed low over a well-constructed railroad bridge, double track. It would have looked good lying flat on the riverbed. As we approached the coast, a low, sprawling city outlined itself against the sea beyond. We were turning right, and left, slowly, keeping a watchful eye in all directions. Tall stacks reached up from the center of the town, obviously a metallurgical installation of some sort. The chimneys might have indicated the blast furnaces of a steel mill. What a target it would have been. A few minutes later we were again over water, our shadow, big and smooth now, chasing alongside of us. For the second time, Herndon called us to give a drift correction to the right. We were favoring the right anyway. Our maps of the coast of Russia up there were not too accurate or detailed. We did not want to take any chance of getting too far to the left. Any map will show you how much left drift you can safely allow on a course from Tokyo to Vladivostok. The border of Korea is not much over 15 miles from Vladivostok itself. Korea would be, of course, as far as we were concerned, the same as Japan. So we were making plenty definite corrections to the right. 15 miles, right or left, is altogether too possible on a 600-mile overwater flight. Now we were entering the murky area where we should have been getting a little turbulence, but we were not. A faint blue tinge was growing brighter by the minute ahead of us, and suddenly, so suddenly it was almost unbelievable, we were out in the April sunshine again without a cloud to break the unending blue. Some unusual air current must have pulled that funnel of haze and smoke from some place miles away to lie across the Sea of Japan. "What do you think, Ski?" I asked. The afternoon was waning. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on our watches. That old B-25 2242 was really showing her stuff. Not a murmur. Well, she should not murmur. She had been consuming enough of our gas to satisfy any plane's appetite. "I was just thinking. What do you think we ought to tell these people when we land?" "Think we ought to tell them who we are and what we have done," said Ski. "Let us wait till we see if they already know." "Can you speak Russian?" I asked. "No," said Ski. "I know a few Polish words. I come from a Polish family. You knew York was not my name until a year or two ago, didn't you?" "Yes. I had heard York was the name you had yours changed to legally after you got out of West Point, right?" I asked. "Yes," he answered. "Most people think my old name is a Russian name, but it is not. It is Polish." We were flying Herndon's given course and keeping a watchful eye out for land. "Boy, how good, dry, friendly land would look to us. Herndon came up out of the nose and said, "Well, about another hour ought to do it." We split a candy bar 3 ways. Not until then did any of us realize our stomachs had been sadly neglected all day, but somehow that much candy was all I could take for the time being. It was cool now. Herndon stayed in the navigator's compartment with Sergeant Laban. "Hope they have 100-octane gas if we find an airdrome," said Ski. "We could get away early in the morning and probably beat the rest of the guys to Chungking," I added. "Or tonight," said Ski, and then, "We are probably not the only one flying this course." We tried to get Pole on the interphone, but he did not answer. We banked slightly right and left, peering behind us. No ships were in sight. We were alone with our ship, with the sky, and the Japanese sea some 50-odd feet below us. At about 4:45, land came slowly into view on the horizon, tall mountains looming dark out of the sea. Lord, what a welcome sight! They were not really so high, they only seemed so to us, flying so low. We started climbing some and corrected our course slightly to the right, where a point of land extended a little out into the sea. About 3 miles out, we turned 90 degrees right and flew north along the coastline. We thought if there was any possibility of having hit the coast south of the big jut of land where Vladivostok lies, we would rather know about it now than after we crossed the shoreline. 10 minutes of flying convinced us, however, that we were actually flying along the Soviet coastline, not Korea's. Herndon was up in the pilot's compartment behind us now with his coastline map of that area. "We are about here," he said, indicating a point about 40 miles north of the peninsular end, and looking from map to coastline and back several times. Ski and I got the map up in front of us and verified our position by outstanding coastline features. So we made a 180-degree turn and started down the coast again, this time closer to shore. The coastline was rugged, with very little beach. One little bay cut inland and a small group of houses could be seen at the head of the bay. We continued on and soon could see the end of the peninsula. There was no sign of anti-aircraft fire. It did not seem a good idea to round the end of the point and come sailing into the port of Vladivostok big as life. It was undoubtedly well defended. So we cut inland. As we turned, we could see, off to the left, the finger-like projection of land extending seaward. "Goodness! Look!" said Ski. He turned the ship slightly so that we had an unobstructed view of a huge airdrome with plenty of orange-winged aircraft, at least 30 to 40 airplanes. "Those must be Navy," I said. "Well, whatever they are, let us get out of here," Ski answered. And with that, we turned slightly and lowered the nose to pick up speed, just in case some Russian happened to notice a 2-engine bomber roaring over an aircraft base on that vulnerable east coast, and decided to shoot it down first and investigate later. We were across the ridge of hills lining the coast now, and we found ourselves approaching an inlet, or bay, at the head of which emptied a fair-sized river. The river flowed seaward through a wide, flat valley, bounded by the hills we had just crossed and another, higher ridge ahead of us. "Let us find us a spot to sit down, what do you say?" said Ski. "A good idea," I said. We were both thinking the same thing. You cannot fly around over the seaboard area of a country at war without someone in that country eventually doing something about it. We were losing altitude now and turned right up the valley. Ahead of us, in the center of the valley, stretched a large square field with some dirty, white, tumbling, rather large buildings on one side. "Here we are," said Ski. "We will fly over this field once and see what the ground looks like." We were about 800 feet above the ground as we went across the field. On my side, I could see a couple of small buildings with a few men dressed in long black coats standing watching us. Just as I spotted a small airplane under a camouflage net not far from the building, Ski hit my arm and said, "It is an airport." The large, dirty white buildings were on his side, as was a T made of white cloth strips on the ground, with black-coated men already arranging the strips to indicate the direction to land. This happened to be the same direction in which we were passing over the field. Just as we started a turn to the left to begin our approach, a small fighter-type bi-wing, single-seat plane came out of a dive on our right side, fairly close to us. We were pulling away from him as he lost his diving speed. "For goodness sake, let us get our wheels down to let him know we are going to land and he won't have to shoot us down," I said, pointing him out to Ski and reaching for the gear control. As our wheels came down, our speed lowered, and our friend, we hoped, stayed on our tail. We were turning now for our straightaway approach. Now the flaps were coming down, all the way down. Then the boundary of the field was behind us, and Ski was breaking our glide. A slight jolt, and we were on the ground. Boy, good old ground. From 8:35 in the morning till about 5:45, over 1,400 miles of water, over a hostile country, and now, at last, dry, good ground. It was a wonderful feeling. The small ship had followed us in and sailed by over our heads. I am going to taxi over here on the right, near that camouflaged ship, Bob. Leave 15 degrees of flaps down and let us take a look at these jokers to see if they have got slant eyes. If they have, we will take off straight ahead. That would have been a fine thing after all that flying, to find slant eyes on the faces of our hosts. But no, as we taxied by a group of curious, staring, black-overcoated men, they smiled. And their eyes were not slanted. We pulled around, facing the open field, pulled the flaps the rest of the way up, and locked our brakes. The sun was low on the horizon. It was clear, and the silence was deafening as our engines slowed and finally stopped. We cut the switches. For a moment no one spoke. I saw about 12 men, all dressed the same, in long black coats with tight black leather belts, blue tabs on their collars, and wearing perfectly round, flat black caps with ribbons in the back and blue lettering on the bands. They were gathering around just off the right wing, looking at our ship with curiosity, and they were grinning. We were in Russia! The reason Ski York's crew landed in Russia could be traced back to the maintenance personnel at Sacramento. Both carburetors on York's plane had been removed without his knowledge, and in spite of the fact that Doolittle had insisted no work be done without permission. No record of the change had been made on the plane's engine forms. Sergeant Ted Laban, the plane's crew chief, discovered on the carrier that the serial numbers on his records did not agree with those on the carburetors themselves. Doolittle had asked York how he felt about it, and York said, "All right." He hoped that the new carburetors would at least have normal consumption, and with luck, would get them to China coast. But the early takeoff, and 2 carburetors set to burn at an excessively rich mixture, caused York to make a command decision to set course for Vladivostok. His only other alternative was to ditch the Mitchell in the China Sea 300 miles from land. Relieved at being safe again on the ground, York and his crew got out of their plane and were approached by a Russian captain. York later described to intelligence officers what happened next. He took us into an office and we sat there for about 2 hours and a half, at which time an interpreter came in and told us that they were fixing something for us to eat. They did not question us about where we had come from, except that pilots would come in now and then and, out of curiosity, point to the map with an inquiring look. We pointed generally in the direction of Alaska. We did not want to tell anyone the truth yet. That night, a naval colonel, who was the commanding officer there, told us through the interpreter that we had been a part of the raid on Japan. He accused us of it, and I admitted we had. I asked him if he would fix us up with gasoline, and if he would, we would take off early the next morning and proceed to China. He agreed. When we went to bed that night, we were fully confident we were going to leave the next morning. But the next morning a general showed up along with a divisional commissar, the equivalent ranking civilian town official. Evidently they had communications from higher headquarters and, after we finished eating, we were placed aboard a Russian DC-3 and flown to Khabarovsk, which is about 400 miles north of Vladivostok. When we arrived there, we were interviewed for a short time by the commander of the Far Eastern Red Army, and he decided that we were to be interned. About 3 days later, our personal belongings were sent to us. They had all been left at the station at Vladivostok. Anything that resembled airplane equipment had been removed, including our pistols. We were placed in a house about 5 miles out of town and very closely guarded. 5 days later, it was announced over the radio that we had landed in the country and had been interned. About 5 days after that, we were taken aboard a train and sent to Penza in European Russia. The trip to Penza took 21 days. Here, the 5 men were shut up in a house. There was a fence around the house, but they were never allowed outside of it. 3 Soviet companions, all captains, were assigned to them full-time. The future looked grim, since it appeared that they were not to enjoy the relative freedom of men who were interned in other countries during the war, like Turkey, Sweden, and Switzerland. They were prisoners for all practical purposes, except that they were not in a prison. Their plight, unfortunately, had been caused by an over-eager American newspaperman in Moscow. During the 5 or 6 days after their arrival in Russia, a news conference had been held in Moscow, at which the raid on Japan by the American airmen had been the main subject of discussion. The American newsman asked what the Russians would do if one of the planes involved in the raid landed in Russia. He insisted so much on an answer that the Russians thought he must have had some information on York's crew being there. Their presence was then announced for fear of Japanese retaliation, since the two nations were not then at war. To remain legally neutral, they were obligated to retain the 5 Americans for the duration. On April 22nd, 4 days after the raid, Ambassador William H. Stanley had radioed Washington that a twin-engine North American bomber had made a forced landing in Primorskaya and said, "The Soviet military authorities would like to have this information kept secret, and especially do not wish that the press should know that a United States Army plane had landed in the Soviet Union." It was over a month before any American representatives were allowed to visit the 5 internees. On May 24th, Colonel Joseph A. Michela, military attaché to Russia, flew to Penza to talk to the 5 men and report on their condition and morale. The next day he radioed the ambassador from Kuibyshev. At this time, crew members are lodged in a large, clean bungalow in a village approximately 10 miles outside of Penza. The bungalow is surrounded by lawns and gardens and adjoining a second house which contains the dining and recreation rooms and also houses 3 Soviet companions, one of whom is an interpreter. For recreation, the Americans have been provided with books, billiards, athletic facilities, and other distractions. All in all, the Soviet authorities have been extremely considerate in providing for the crew. The food which the men receive is superior to that obtainable by the diplomatic corps in Kuibyshev, and the men are allowed the same freedom of movement permitted to chiefs of mission at Kuibyshev. All men seem to be in excellent mental and physical condition. It is stated that their only complaint is that they are urged to eat and drink too much. York and his crew stayed at Penza for 2.5 months, and then were moved to the small village of Okansk, 80 miles south of Molotov, where they remained for the next 8 months. About 4 months after their arrival in Okansk, the guards were taken away, and the 5 men lived by themselves, although visited by the Russians daily. On September 13th, Ambassador Stanley wired the State Department that he and 3 others had visited York and his men, and reported that the crew is found to be comfortably housed, adequately fed, are in good health and generally well cared for, and that their principal concern was the welfare of their families. The truth was that York and his men were bored from the inactivity and the uncertainty of their status. They pleaded for something useful to do. On November 6th, a formal request was sent by Major General Follett Bradley, on special assignment in Moscow, to the Pentagon, recommending that the Secretary of War direct American Embassy Moscow arrange with Soviet authorities permit Major York and crew to participate in useful professional work. They have not been asked for, nor have they given their paroles, which would be necessary if they are permitted to fly. They are most anxious to work, and I believe would give necessary paroles. If official request is made to Soviets, I believe they would comply. While waiting for word from Washington, the 5 airmen were allowed the free run of the village of Okansk, which was not saying much. The people were poor, food was scarce, and the luxuries of life were non-existent. They had no soap, tobacco, matches, or even the barest of extras. Schools had been closed for the duration, and there was only one newspaper for the entire population, which was posted in the center of town. There was only one radio, which had loudspeakers attached so that everyone could hear the news from Radio Moscow. The only fringe benefit was a motion picture theatre, an old barn, which showed occasional propaganda films, and, much to the delight of the raiders, good but old American films. Time seemed to stand still for the Americans. Washington continued to ignore the November message request. The days and nights ran together with monotony. They talked, slept, read and reread the letters they had received from the States, and studied the Russian language. It began to be an effort to study or take an interest in anything. They found themselves numbed as the days went by endlessly without any real contact with the outside world. After the New Year, they began to talk of escape as soon as the intense cold of winter subsided. On the off chance that they could make a dent in Soviet officialdom with a plea for release from their enforced idleness, they composed a letter to Premier Stalin and asked that they be allowed to leave Russia, promising that their departure would be kept a secret. If this was not possible, they asked to be moved to a warmer climate and allowed to work where their training as a B-25 crew could be utilized. They really never expected to hear from the letter which they had given to their interpreter, but anything was worth a try. On March 25th, the unexpected did happen. On that day, 2 Russian officers arrived and told them that their letter had been received in Moscow in the headquarters of the Red Army, and that they were to be granted the second and third parts of their requests. The first could not be granted. Within an hour they departed by automobile for Molotov, then by plane and train to Ashkabbad, not far from the Persian border. True to the promise of the 2 officers, as soon as they arrived in their new surroundings, they were given work passes, outfitted with working clothes, and assigned to an aircraft overhaul shop for bi-winged training planes. York and Emmons were given the job of dismantling fuselages and tearing away old fabric from the frames. Herndon and Pohl cleaned instruments while Laban worked on the small engines. After a few weeks of this, however, the urge to escape returned, and assisted by a friendly Russian named Kolya, they arranged with a Persian border runner by the name of Abdul Aram to be smuggled into Iran. For the sum of $300, they were taken to the city of Meshhed by the crafty Persian. After several near misses with Russian border guards, the quintet turned themselves in to the British consul and returned to the United States on May 29, 1943. Both York and Emmons had become fathers while they were gone. While their treatment could not be compared with that received by the 8 men imprisoned by the Japanese, it had a lasting effect on York and his men. They were among the first Americans to realize that the Soviet Union had a population, as Bob Emmons expressed it, controlled by terror and violence, nurtured on fear and suspicion. It was Bob Emmons who became one of the first Americans in uniform to warn what communism really meant. In the closing lines of his book, Guests of the Kremlin, he wrote, "Communism, like a malignant scab on the skin of the world, is spreading north, south, east, and west. Fight it." While I was loading our gear in the rear hatch of our plane, the Whirling Dervish, I took one last look down the deck toward the bow. Colonel Doolittle had already taken off, and the second plane was now revving up its engines. Man, I thought to myself, that deck sure does look short. But it was nice to know that it could be done. Before the colonel did it, though, there was a little doubt in the minds of some of us. I busied myself straightening up the rear compartment as Lieutenant Watson taxied into position. Before I could really worry about it, we were blasting down the deck and into the air. Takeoff was so simple that you would have thought we did that kind of thing every day. My troubles as engineer started soon after the wheels were tucked up, however. The bottom tank, where the lower turret had been taken out, started to leak at the corner seams about 14 inches from the top. I called Lieutenant Watson on the interphone, and we transferred gas out of that tank as soon as we could burn it out of the mains. That done, I turned my attention to my guns and found that they would not charge because of a malfunction of the hydraulic charger. I removed this mechanism as quickly as I could and found that I could charge them by hand. About an hour away from the Hornet, we passed a freighter which surprised us all. It was about then that I started opening the 5-gallon cans of gas and poured them into the turret tanks. The gas was then immediately transferred to the wing tanks. After emptying all the cans, I cut holes in them and threw them overboard. For a long time the flight was routine, but then we began to see small fishing vessels and knew that the shoreline was not too far ahead. But before we saw a beach, we could see the beautiful mountains of Japan, and it looked exactly like the geography book pictures I remember in grammar school. It was hard to believe that this was enemy territory. We made landfall over a long, sweeping sandy beach, and just below us as we flew in was an airfield with a line of silver planes, parked wingtip to wingtip on the ground, with their bright orange rising sun insignia painted on each wing. Tip. These looked like bombers, and nearby some fighters were warming up as if on alert. Since planes on the ground could not hurt us, I kept my eyes peeled for any that were in the air, and off to the left I saw 5 of them. I turned my turret guns toward them, but they were small bi-winged trainers and could not have caught us. It was easy to see when we neared Tokyo because the flak started. I will never forget the strange feeling I had watching the black puffs breaking ahead of us. That stuff could hurt us, but it was hard to believe that anyone would shoot at us deliberately. Of course, this was the first enemy flak any of us had ever seen. Fortunately, it was very inaccurate, probably for the reason that we were the first enemy planes that the Japanese AK gunners had ever fired on. As we headed toward the city of Tokyo, we flew over an airport that looked like it might have been the strip for an aircraft factory, and the flak immediately got worse. At first, the bursts were below us, but then started bursting above us. As soon as they did, Lieutenant Watson dropped to rooftop level, zigzagging as he went. We continued toward our target and pulled upward so Bissell could let go our bombs. When he called, "Bombs away," over the interphone, I looked backward to see where they would hit. The target was on a sand spit out in the water and appeared to be two saw-toothed roof buildings connected by a building running at right angles. I saw two of our bombs hit the building and spray debris everywhere. Out of the corner of my eye, though, I saw something else. Tracers were looping up at us from behind and below from a single fighter that was only 100 yards away from us and pointing straight at me. I opened fire only to find that my sight fogged up. All I could do was keep my finger on the trigger and aim with my tracers. As my bullets came closer and closer, the enemy fighter fell off on the left wing and I never saw it again. I think I got him, but I will never be able to swear to it. Lieutenant Watson dropped the plane down to the rooftops again and headed out over Tokyo Bay. I saw a large number of barges, a few tankers, and, as we paralleled the coast, 2 cruisers and a battleship loomed out of the haze. The battleship opened fire with everything it had. Lieutenant Watson, by this time, had throttled way back to conserve gasoline and kept right on going. However, when he saw the shells hitting the water all around us, he shoved the throttles forward and got out of there. I could see the battleship still firing as we left it way behind and settled back down to maximum cruising power. I saw several fishing boats during the next few hours and fired on them with the turret guns. However, I do not think I hit them. My purpose was merely to add to the confusion I hoped we had created back in Tokyo. I figured it might help us all if reports from scared Japanese fishermen would come pouring into their Navy headquarters. As we churned on, hour after hour, I remember that the gasoline situation weighed on everyone's mind. We all knew it would be short because of the extra mileage we had to cover. Lieutenant Watson and Lieutenant Parker had talked it over, and then talked it over with the rest of us. We would stay on our course for our destination in China as long as the gas held out. When it looked like we were not going to make it, we would look for a fishing boat, strafe it, ditch beside it, take it over, and sail toward the China coast. Before we could take any action on our plan, however, the weather changed our ideas. We began to run into fog, and as it got thicker, we began to climb over it. We went higher and higher and then had to go into it. The fog became rain, and the B-25 began to shudder and shake as we bored into updrafts and downdrafts. We all agreed that the best thing to do now was to head in a southerly direction, away from Japanese-held territory, and bail out when our gas was gone. Because of Lieutenant Watson's constant attention to conserving gas, we did not know it then, but we flew further inland than any of the other planes by a considerable distance. After an amazing 15.5 hours in the air, our engines started the sputtering we had been waiting to hear for about 2 hours. We were still in the soup and could not even see our wingtips. Lieutenant Watson told me to go first, so I stuffed some cigarettes and a pint of whiskey in my jacket, removed the rear hatch, faced toward the rear, and dropped out head first. I pulled the ripcord immediately. The chute opened and started to swing me back and forth. Before I could realize that I had actually bailed out of an airplane, I felt the chute snag in the top of a tree as I swung forward and dropped gently right into the fork of another. Since I seemed solidly on a perch of some kind, I waited a few minutes collecting my thoughts and wondered how high up in the tree I was. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a cigarette and matches and took a few puffs. Then I flicked the ash off the cigarette and dropped it to see how far it would go. That little glow dropped down, 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 and finally out of sight. For all I knew, I was several hundred feet up in the air. My predicament scared me more than a little, and I decided that I was about as safe as anyone could be with my parachute harness on and the canopy hooked firmly in the branches. I remembered the pint of whiskey, which was still intact, so I sipped it slowly and gradually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I saw that I was not as bad off as I had feared. True, I was hanging in a tree on the edge of a cliff, but it was not hard to climb down. Had I tried to climb down in the dark and slipped or gotten careless, though, it would have been curtains. I climbed up the mountain as soon as I could see any distance, but could not see anything that looked like civilization. I figured that if I headed due west, though, in a country as overpopulated as China, I would be bound to run into something. I walked most of the day, and finally at 3 o'clock that afternoon came to a farmhouse where they gave me rice and peppers. By sign language, I learned that 2 men had preceded me down the valley, and in 30 minutes of walking, I met Lieutenants Parker and Griffin. We decided to continue along the stream that ran along the valley and reasoned that eventually the stream would come to a village or city. By late afternoon, we were tired and soaking wet from the drizzle that had been falling most of the day. We came upon a farmhouse, and the farmer invited us inside and allowed us to take off our clothes and dry ourselves by his fire. We all put our guns on the table and were huddled around the fire when suddenly a Chinese officer appeared in the doorway, holding a scroll in one hand and a pistol in the other. Turning around quickly, we found that our own pistols had disappeared from the table and that other Chinese were covering us with rifles from every window and door. We were their prisoners. You can imagine what we were thinking that night as we were marched about 5 miles, held captive by a Chinese army unit, none of whom could speak English or would try to interpret our sign language. The words, Lishua Megwa, I am an American, that Commander Jurika had taught us on board the carrier meant nothing in their district. After a miserable night, the next morning 2 Catholic missionaries, Fathers Moore and Dunkir from Ihwang, a nearby town, identified us as Americans, and we suddenly became heroes. They wined and dined us, and the priests furnished us with shoes and underclothes. For a week we stayed at the home of the local mandarin and ate our meals at the mission. 2 days after we arrived at the mission, our pilot, Lieutenant Dr. Watson, was brought in with a badly injured shoulder. He was the last to bail out and had gotten his arm tangled up in the shroud lines. His right arm was badly dislocated and he could not get it back in place. It was to be weeks before he would get any relief from the pain, and he would have to have an operation at Walter Reed Hospital in the States before he could use that arm again. Sergeant Wayne Bissell, our bombardier, came in a day or 2 later, having also been held captive by Chinese bandits. He had escaped by simply running away when no one was looking. We did not know about any of the other crews, but at least ours was all safe and it made us feel good. Before we left Ihwang, we were taken to the wreckage of our plane, which had ploughed into a hillside several miles away. It had not burned and a lot of our equipment was still intact. Lieutenant Griffin's suitcase was in perfect shape, and he got everything back, even his dress uniform, which he has to this day. We left Ihwang with Father Dunkir as guide and travelled for 2 days by sedan chair to Nanchang, where we arrived on April 30th. We left there later that day by station wagon and arrived at Hengyang via Tahoe on May 3rd. We stayed there until May 14th before we were flown out to Chungking. While we waited in Hengyang, we realized how close to the war we were. The Japanese were out looking for us in strength on the ground and in the air. Every day an observation plane came over. 2 of those days it was followed by bombers that dropped their loads on the town. It was only the beginning of the war for us all, but the Chinese were to pay a far greater price than we Americans. 2 years after I made my report in Chungking, I picked up a copy of the May 1944 issue of the Reader's Digest and learned what happened to the kindly Chinese who helped me join my crew and get to safety. Reverend Charles L. Mears, a Protestant missionary, had taken a trip to Ihwang in the fall of 1942, where he visited Wang Pu Fang, a barber friend, who invited him to occupy his brand-new makeshift chair, the bombardier's seat from our B-25. He learned from the 80-year-old English-speaking village schoolteacher that our crew had parachuted nearby and that he would show Reverend Mears the scene of the crash. His letter to the Reader's Digest said, "The mountain path we followed snaked in and out where high cliffs, hairy with pine and fern, overhung deep ravines split by white cascades." Suddenly the old teacher pointed. "There," he said. On a green cushion of laurel bushes, shining in the light of the setting sun, glistened the silvery wings of the bomber. Yes, there was the pine tree in which Sergeant Scott had hung from his parachute till daybreak yonder, the creek where Lieutenant Watson had fainted, to lie for hours in the icy water. "We fed the Americans and carried them to safety," the little teacher said, "so that they could bomb Tokyo again. Then the dwarf invaders came. They took the lives of my 3 sons and my wife, Angxing. They set fire to my school. They burned my books. They drowned my grandchildren in the well." His eyes shone fiercely. "And I crawled out of the well at night, when they were drunk, and terminated them with my own hands, one for every dead member of my family." He sat down on the wing of the plane. "This is a symbol," he told me, patting the great black bold letters United States, "a bridge between our 2 peoples, and a token of the hopes of the peoples of all the world." It was then that I knew that our raid on Japan had been truly successful. Reverend Mias took a fragment of our plane, the Whirling Dervish, and brought it to Washington to give to the Vicar Apostolic of Nanking, Bishop Paul U. Pin. Bishop U. Pin sent it to Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt on July 2nd, 1944, saying, "I am presenting this fragment to you on the eve of the 777 anniversary, when 7 years ago, on the 7th day of the 7th month, July 7th, 1937, the Japanese brought war to our land. This piece of our plane, a portion of the cowling of the right engine nacelle, was later mounted by the North American Aviation Company and presented to the Tokyo Raiders for our archives. It is the only piece of any plane to return to the States." As soon as Watson's plane blasted off the deck, I lined up and took off about 5 minutes later. I had been slightly delayed due to the continued misfiring of the right engine, which finally smoothed out. The takeoff was easy, although I sweated out that right engine during those critical moments of the roll down the deck. I circled the carrier once and flew parallel to its course and set my gyro compass and compared it with the magnetic compass. We picked up a true course of 270 degrees, about 500 feet off the water. About an hour and a half out, Sergeant Horton, on watch in the upper turret, shouted over the interphone, "Gunner to pilot, twin-engine plane, 12 o'clock." Directly ahead and above us was a Japanese patrol plane, and it must have seen us at the same time because it immediately dove out of the clouds directly at us. I increased the power on both engines and swept underneath it. We quickly outdistanced it and did not attempt to fire on it because it never really got within range. After that incident, I decided to fly the rest of the distance at altitudes ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 feet in order to fly in the thin, overcast and clouds to avoid detection. We hit Inubosaki right on the nose, thanks to our navigator, Sally Crouch. I turned south for about 10 miles, and then turned west across the neck of land to Tokyo Bay, then northwest at 3,500 feet, in and out of the scattered clouds. When I sighted my target, I dove out of the clouds, and lined up with the target at 2,400 feet and 210 miles per hour speed. I opened the bomb bay doors, and just as I did, an aircraft carrier steaming toward the Yokosuka Naval Base opened up on us with their ack of presumably small caliber. Fortunately, their fire was ineffective and inaccurate. However, since we were toward the last of the bomber string, they were waiting for us, and I knew it would be no picnic the rest of the way in. We lined up on our primary target, the Japan Special Steel Company, and dropped 2 500-pound demos and got direct hits. One bomb hit directly in the middle of a big building, and the other landed between 2 buildings, destroying the end sections of both. The third demo and the incendiary cluster were dropped in the heavy industrial section in the Shiba ward. The ack fire became intense, and since I had taken a long straight run on the target, by the time the bombs were out, we found ourselves bracketed with the black puffs of smoke and shrapnel coming very close, generally behind but catching up fast. Just as the last bomb went out, a formation of 9 Zeros came in above us and a little to our right. I jammed the throttles forward and went into a steep diving turn to the left to escape both the ack fire and the fighters. The fighters had definitely seen us and peeled off at us, but I dove under them and eluded them for the moment. We were doing 330 miles per hour, which was right on the red line. I leveled out right on the ground and hedge-hopped all the way back out to the bay. 3 Nakajima 97s came out of nowhere ahead and to our left. They tried to catch us but could not keep up. The Zeros, however, had not been shaken. They had an altitude advantage but did not seem too eager to come in close. I could hear Horton firing at them from the turret from time to discourage them. We finally shook them as I turned west across the mountains. Shortly after, a single fighter appeared alongside and above us, just as I turned south again. We fired at him with both nose and turret guns, and we think we hit him, but none of us was sure we knocked him down. At any rate, he got extremely discouraged, which was okay with us. Just as we thought we had it made, and I had begun to throttle back when 3 more enemy fighters bored in toward us. I pushed the throttles forward and climbed up into the clouds to elude them. I decided to turn out to sea for about 30 miles, since it looked like they were really after us. Fortunately, that was the last enemy plane we ever saw. When we passed through the Oshima Strait and headed west, I took inventory of our damage. We had sustained 1 anti-aircraft hit in the rear fuselage just ahead of the horizontal stabilizer. The hole was about 7 inches in diameter. Luckily, no vital structural part was hit, and about all it did was create quite a draft. We were also hit on the left wing tip by machine gun bullets, but, again, The damage was slight. A few feet closer to the fuselage, however, and we would probably have lost gas, to say the least. As soon as we estimated we were nearing the China coast, the weather became foggy and rainy. I was forced to go on instruments about 100 miles out, and stayed on them until we all bailed out. Our automatic pilot was inoperative, so I had to hand fly it all the way. Stork, of course, relieved me and shared the flying chore. About the time Crouch estimated we should begin to climb to avoid the mountains along the coast, we spotted an island and got a few glimpses of land as we came in over the coast. Those few glimpses gave us assurance that at least we were over land. It was now getting dark, still foggy and rainy, and getting worse. There was an overcast above us, so I climbed up into it and continued on course. As we neared our estimated time of arrival at Chuchao, I realized positively that we could never expect to make a landing in that weather, so I told the crew to get ready to bail out. I climbed to 9,000 feet with about 15 minutes of gas left. I had flown deliberately past Chuchao to be sure that we would come down in Chinese territory. I had been talking back and forth to my crew from time to time, and when I figured we had only about 10 minutes of gas left, I asked Crouch to show us on the map where we were. I then gave them their instructions. "Horton, you go first out the rear hatch," I said. "Then Larkin, then Sally and Stork out the front. Larkin, you wait until Horton is gone before you release the forward escape door, you might hit him." "Okay, fellas, that is it. I will see you all in Chuchao. Let me know when you are ready back there, Ed, and good luck to you." "Okay, Lieutenant," Horton answered over the interphone. "Here I go, and thanks for a swell ride." I could not help but laugh at that, and it made me feel good. Here we had been flying for about 14 hours, had been in combat and hit, and now had to bail out, and he thanked me for the ride. Horton's spirit of discipline was typical of my whole crew, and I was thankful. I was busy keeping the plane's speed at 120 miles per hour on instruments and felt them go one by one. They were fine men. Not one was afraid, but bitterly disappointed that we had to abandon our plane. It takes men like them to win a war, and that is what we were trying to do. When the last man was gone, I rolled the stabilizer back to keep the plane from gaining too much speed, and then worked myself around to get out of the cockpit. I had some trouble squeezing in between the armor plate on the backs of the two seats, and had to keep pushing the wheel forward to keep the plane from stalling. I had little time to do anything once I got to the escape hatch, but I did manage to grab some food and equipment before I jumped. I dropped clear of the ship and pulled the ripcord. The chute opened nicely, but just as it did, the metal on one of the leg straps broke and almost dropped me out of the chute harness. I slid down and the chest buckle socked me in the chin so hard I was stunned. At the same time, my pistol was jerked out of its holster and flew into space. I swung wildly for about a minute and then straightened out. Just as I did, I heard the plane hit below me and explode. A few seconds later I hit the ground, which was quite a surprise. Luckily I was uninjured, even though I had landed on the side of a steep slope. It was raining and foggy, and I could not see a thing. I felt I had no choice but to wrap myself up in my parachute and try to stay dry and get some sleep. The next morning it was still foggy, but the rain had stopped. When it was clear enough for me to see, I started to look for our plane. When I saw how steep the hill was that I had landed on and saw how sharp the boulders were, I do not see how I missed getting badly hurt or worse. The plane turned out to be only a mile away, but it took me 4 hours to get there over the rocks and cliffs. When I got to the site of the crash, there were a number of Chinese there picking in the charred wreckage. I hailed them and made them understand that I was a friend. There was not a single thing I could salvage out of the wreck. It was a total loss. There was nothing to do but start walking. The Chinese farmers took me to a town where I stayed that night. The next day I met some Chinese soldiers who escorted me to Tunki, Anhui, and a week later, Chuxian. My crew was safe and had no serious injuries. We had a lot to be thankful for. The trip aboard the Hornet had been thoroughly enjoyable. I never knew the Navy lived so plushly aboard ship. After what we had been through at Columbia, living in tents and standing in chow lines, it was a pleasure to eat huge meals from plates and with ice cream yet. They also relaxed their rules about gambling aboard ship because we actually played a lot of poker right on board. I will never forget the morning of the 18th, as I am sure none of the other fellows will either. We had been given mattresses to put on the floor. Deck, and I was lying there in my undershirt and shorts, getting all the last-minute rest I could. I had eaten an early breakfast and paid by check for the food that I had put away during the 18 days aboard the Hornet. I had already shaved, so decided to pack my bag. This included an electric razor, camera, a civilian coat and slacks, and several boxes of candy bars. I had put my navigation equipment away in several briefcases. That loudspeaker announcement telling us to man our planes sounded convincingly like the real thing, especially when the ship's pom-pom guns started to fire. So I quickly dressed and headed to the flight deck with my belongings, loading them aboard our plane, the Hari carrier. Captain Ross Greening, our pilot, had taken over our crew halfway through training at Eglin. Ross was from another squadron, and the crew and myself knew very little about him. However, after our first training flight together, we knew that we were lucky. We had one of the best. He was daring, but knew his airplane and his own limitations, and was well coordinated and exceptionally strong. If the others could do it, we knew he could too. The other 10 planes had made it, so it was just a matter of getting on with it. Still, I will have to admit that riding as a navigator and having to trust your life to the skill of another is not without its stomach-tightening moments. This was one of them. Surprisingly, the takeoff was easy. Since the Hornet could swing into the wind, there was no drift as we started to roll. If we did drift either way before we had flying speed, it would have been disastrous. As soon as we were airborne, I dutifully noted our takeoff heading and time off. In spite of what we hoped, the Navy had not given us any weather information so that we would have some idea as to the weather ahead of us. All we knew was that the wind was 27 knots from 310 degrees when we left the Hornet. From the Hornet into Japan, I practiced working out navigation problems from a navigation book called Driesenstock. A navigator buddy of mine who was not going offered to help carry some of my equipment to the flight deck. I made my way through stacked planes with their props turning over and across the rolling deck, which was wet and slippery, to our plane. My friend followed behind with the rest of my gear. Occasionally it had been necessary to kneel down and wait for the rolling deck to temporarily come to a level position and then proceed for 10 feet or so. I reached our plane, placed my equipment inside, and then headed back to the ship's island for a final time check and ship's position. I passed my friend who was headed for the plane. Somehow he failed to get my equipment into the right plane. During this trip to the plane, a cruiser, the Nashville, crossed in front of the Hornet as it was engaged in firing at a Japanese vessel. All I had in the way of equipment was my briefcase full of odds and ends. One of these items was a navigation book I had never used before. So, for some 4 hours en route to Japan, I practiced working celestial navigation problems at random to be able to navigate after nightfall. Our target was a refinery in Yokohama. However, we decided on an alternate target, just in case. When we crossed the coastline, I remember thinking that it looked like Southern California, but I knew I should not be thinking about things like that. Shortly after I had pinpointed our position as being considerably north, of course, we passed over a training field and noticed many bi-winged trainers in the air. People on the ground waved at us as we zoomed over their heads at 500 feet, and some ran to hide behind bushes. About 30 miles out from our target, 4 fighters came out of nowhere. One of them made a pass at us while we were at cruising speed, 166 miles per hour. Greening pushed the throttles forward to the end of the quadrant, and we indicated 260 miles per hour. The fighter made another pass at us, but our turret gunner, Sergeant Gardner, drove him off with a few bursts. At 260 miles per hour, the fighters found it difficult to overtake us. As we neared our primary target, we noticed planes converging on us from all directions. Obviously, being in the tail end of a bomber stream had its disadvantages. Greening decided to go after the alternate target, which was an oil refinery and tank farm. The explosives, 4 incendiary clusters, were dropped from 600 feet instead of the planned 1,500. We got a stiff jolt from below as they all went off. We immediately headed out into Tokyo Bay, and the smoke and flames were visible for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Another enemy fighter had made a pass at us from the rear just as we dropped our explosives, and Gardner scored a direct hit. It pulled up into a steep climb, smoking heavily. We were sure it crashed, although we did not see it go in. After executing the maneuver known as getting the heck out, we turned on a heading of 250 degrees to parallel the coast about 50 miles offshore. We occasionally climbed up into the clouds at about 3,000 feet to escape detection from surface vessels. When we reached the southern tip of Japan, we turned and headed across the China Sea as it became dark. Halfway across, we ran into fog and under an overcast. We stayed on top of the fog, which rose gradually and joined the clouds. When it got dark, we knew what the outcome of our mission would be. We were going to have to trade our B-25 for that oil refinery. But it could have been worse. At least we were going down in friendly territory, or were we? After we went into the overcast, I could only compute our course by dead reckoning since no star shots could be made and the Chinese homing beacons we expected never came on the air. It was approximately 11:30 in the evening ship's time when Greening gave us the order to jump. Our altimeter indicated 9,500 feet, and we hoped that was high enough. We had briefly dropped below the clouds and saw a few lights on the ground, as well as mountain peaks all around us. We could never land a plane here. Sergeant Mel Gardner was called up front from the rear compartment, and he went first. Sergeant Bill Birch followed. I went next, and as soon as I got out, my chute opened almost immediately. The candy bars I had so carefully stashed in my shirt and the flashlight, which I had stuck under my belt and left on, disappeared as if by magic. I watched the lighted flashlight falling for what seemed like several minutes. I guess it really took me about 3 minutes to reach the ground. My shroud lines were twisted, and I was never sure that my main chute was fully open, because it looked awfully small way up above me. Trying to get the lines untangled caused me to oscillate and go around in circles, and I started to feel sick at my stomach. I thought my time had come. Actually, I lucked out. My chute caught in the top of a pine tree on a steep, slippery mountainside as I went by it. The tree was soft and broke my fall so nicely that I felt no shock at all as I touched the ground. I came to rest facing the sky, with my Army 45 and canteen under my back. The parachute shroud lines prevented me from rolling over. Several times I tried to get to my feet, but all I accomplished was sliding several feet further down the slippery, pitch-black mountainside. I decided to stay where I was until daylight. I pulled part of the parachute over me, which shortly became soaking wet. It was the longest night I have ever had, as I tried to sleep with rain beating in my face. The next morning I loosened my chute, climbed up to a trail above me and followed it into a valley. In the valley, I approached some friendly Chinese farmers. After much refusal of unappetizing-looking food and much good-natured sign language, I was escorted up the mountain again after my chute. I recovered it, and with a couple of my newly found friends, started walking through Chinese villages heading west. Before long, my caravan was some 200 strong. I felt like Lawrence of Arabia stalking ahead of my army, except I really did not know where I was leading them. A few hours later, I noticed another caravan converging on us from another direction. Leading it were Sergeants Birch and Gardner. They were enjoying the attention they were receiving, although Gardner had sprained both ankles badly. We united forces, and I felt very much reassured. I had a little Chinese wine to drink and was feeling no pain. We kept on walking, and I began to think we might spend the rest of our lives in China. The Chinese started to guide us in a northerly direction after we ate something that seemed like noodle soup. We got a little concerned because we knew that Japanese-occupied territory lay to the north, but after a mile or so, we came to a river and started westward again. We must have gone 5 or 6 miles upriver when we reached a fair-sized village where a few Chinese soldiers were quartered. One of them spoke a little English, and from him we learned that Ross Greening and Ken Reddy, our co-pilot, had been there a short time before and had continued on upstream to Chusian, another 30 miles. We kept going and arrived in Chusian at about 10 that night, where we were given hot tea, hot milk and crackers. After resting, we were taken to the only hotel in town where our 2 missing buddies were already ensconced and fast asleep. We found that Reddy had hit the ground head first, and still had a piece of rock stuck in his scalp to prove what he said happened. He was slightly woozy, but we bandaged him up and he had it removed later when we got to Chungking. We had mixed feelings about the raid when we got together and talked about it. We knew we had accomplished our mission all right, but we sure hated to have to report that we had to give up one perfectly good airplane. The Hari carrier lived up to its name and committed harikari all right, something we had not expected when we named her. Ross Greening summed it up for us when he said, "Well, I think they will call the mission a success. But there is one thing you will have to admit," he added. "What is that?" we asked in unison. "It was one of those that will have to go down as not as briefed." We agreed with him. I was sound asleep when the order was given for us to man our planes. Frankly, I thought it was a practice alert and did not get too excited about it. Fact is, I went up on deck without my briefcase and had to hurry back down to my cabin to pack. Naval officers who were my roommates were making remarks as to how envious they were of me while I packed my bags. At that moment I was almost tempted to turn over my briefcase to them and let them have at it. I had not even had my breakfast yet, and it did not seem the way that we had planned it. The extra stuff I packed was the same as most of the other fellows, cigarettes and candy bars, because we figured we would never be able to get them in China, especially at Navy shipboard prices. As it turned out, I do not think a single man ever got his cigarettes or candy unless he had them in his inside pockets. Our pilot, Lieutenant Bill Bauer, was in the airplane by the time I had gotten back on deck. Bill is the most unruffled, unhurried man I know. It seemed like he was as unconcerned about this raid as he could possibly be. My impression was that it was just another cross-country trip to him. Only difference was that the takeoff strip was a little shorter than usual. Believe me, flying with a man like that is good for the nerves of a navigator, and I was not a bit scared as we taxied onto the takeoff line. Takeoff was more normal than some of the others, it seemed to me. Bill did not snap the wheel back or let the plane ride up as fast. We settled down on course quickly at about 500 feet. Being the navigator, I kept busy all the way in. We could not smoke because of the gasoline cans in the rear and the collapsible tank in the crawlway, so I just tried to figure our wind drift and estimate when and where we would make landfall. We were following the ship ahead of us in the distance, and I was pretty sure that we were correcting a little too far to the north. We saw several small fishing craft just off the coast, and they reminded me that we were just about to fly over hostile territory. When we finally crossed the coast, I was now sure we were north, of course, and we turned southwest toward our target in Yokohama. I searched all over the map. I had to try to recognize something, but I will have to admit that I was lost. I suggested to Bill that we turn out to the coast again and follow it down until we hit our intended landfall point and go into the target from there. I began to locate checkpoints on the ground that agreed with my map, and we started in toward Yokohama a second time. As soon as we did, we saw quite a few aircraft, both on the ground and in the air. Before we could do anything about it, we flew right through the traffic pattern of an airbase, and planes were all around us. None of them seemed to recognize us because no one came after us. After crossing the bay, we noted balloons ahead and saw that they were at 1,000 feet right over our target, the docks at Yokohama. They did not bother Bill or Sergeant Bither, our bombardier. We just climbed up over them to 1,200 feet, opened the bomb doors and let all 4 explosives go in trail. I was watching through the drift meter and saw them hit. There was no doubt but that a lot of work was stopped on the docks that day. While I was watching through the drift meter, we encountered flak, but it was light and very inaccurate. Bill dove for the deck and we scooted away over the housetops. On the way back toward the water, Bither strafed a power station and some Japanese soldiers with the .30 caliber nose gun. I recall that I was very tense at the time. Because we were not allowed to smoke, I was chewing gum. My mouth had become so dry that the gum got stuck all over the inside of my mouth, and I felt I really had a mouth full of cotton. Funny how you can recall something like that many years later. We saw a few aircraft after leaving the target area, but none of them came after us. We continued south and then west, as most of the other planes had done, and as we passed away from Japan, some naval craft turned broadside to us and started firing. Bill Bauer took one look and calmly circled away from them out of the line of fire. Bill did a double drift maneuver for me so that I could figure out what the wind was doing to us. Much to our surprise and pleasure, we found that we had a tailwind. If it would stay with us, I figured we could just about make the China coast. We all felt a lot better then because we would never have made it with any kind of a headwind. Fortunately, the wind stayed with us, and now our only worry was whether or not we could make it from the coast to our intended destination. We were about 3 hours out from land when we ran into low ceilings and poor visibility. We stayed under the stuff at about 500 feet until I figured we were about an hour from land. At this point, we decided to see if we could get above it, or at least between layers, at an altitude which would permit clearing the mountains. We felt this was the best decision, even if bailout became necessary, because it was getting dark and I did not feel confident that we were exactly on course. I figured a no-wind condition, but made small southerly corrections periodically because we knew our chances of not being captured would be better if we were south of our destination. We were cruising at about 9,000 feet when I figured our estimated time of arrival was up. We had about 20 minutes of gas left, so Bill had everyone assemble in the navigator's compartment. Sergeant Bither grabbed his parachute in the dark of the nose of the plane and started to crawl rearward. It was a chest pack that is buckled on a harness before bailout, and he grabbed the ripcord handle instead of the carry strap. His chute sprang open, and there he was, with an armful of white silk. There were no spare chutes aboard, so Bither had no choice if he were going to bail out. He had to repack that chute in a few minutes right there. Bither used my navigator's table, and about 5 minutes later he had a reasonable facsimile of a packed chute. Bill looked back and asked him if he thought it would work, and Bither said he was not worried. So, clasping both arms around the pack fastened on his chest, he dropped through the hatch. Sergeant Williams, the engineer gunner, was next, then me. I scraped my arm on something on the way out. When my chute opened, it knocked the wind out of me. When I got my wind back, I took my flashlight out, and just as I did, I hit the ground and the wind was knocked out of me again. I recovered after a few seconds, gathered up my chute, and then decided to stay put. I rolled up in the chute to stay dry and warm until daylight. I slept like a log from exhaustion and woke up to the realization that I now had a survival problem on my hands. I remembered hearing the sound of running water when I was floating down the night before, and thought it must have been the ocean and that I had bailed Bither and Williams out in the water. But it turned out to be a river, for which I was thankful. I had always been told to follow streams and rivers if lost, and that is exactly what I decided to do now because I could not have been more lost than I was then. I followed the stream for about an hour and ran into our co-pilot, Thad Blanton. We crossed the river and made our way along a well-used path to a small village. We decided to take our chances and walk right in. We did this and did not see a soul. We walked right through town without seeing a living thing. It gave us the creeps, but we decided to keep on going. About a half-hour later, Sergeant Bither caught up with us. He told us he had made friends in a little village nearby by giving a child some candy and had been treated kindly. We turned around and went back. We found this time that the people had hidden because they were afraid of Blanton and me. I showed them my maps, and they showed us where we were, about 40 miles northwest of our intended destination. We started walking in that direction. That night we came to another small village and were welcomed to spend the night. They bedded us down all right, on wooden tables. The only advantage I could see was that it got us off the cold floor, but what a way to sleep. Bill Bauer had arrived shortly before we did and was given a message, via sign language, by one of the Chinese that Sergeant Duquette was being brought in but that his foot was hurt. Next morning, sure enough, some Chinese coolies carried him in with a broken foot. While we were pondering what to do, we got another message from Sally Crouch of Joyce's crew that they were in Siuan, the next town. The Chinese made sedan chairs for us out of our parachute harnesses and carried us all the next day to meet Joyce's crew. We went from there to Chuchao, where we were well treated for the next 6 days, although we had to hide in a cave during the daylight hours because of Japanese air attacks. But when about 20 of us had collected, we started out for Chungking by bus, train, boat, and, eventually, airplane. Every little town we came to insisted on giving the glorious American airmen a celebration. They were grateful that we had bombed the land of the dwarfs and were helping them in their war. We learned later that joy was turned to sorrow for many of them because the Japanese swept through the area and eliminated hundreds of them for helping us. Lieutenant Edgar E. McElroy of Ennis, Texas, was pilot of our crew. He was about 30 then, heavy-set, with a rapidly receding hairline and a jovial face. Lieutenant Clayton J. Campbell of Oregon was navigator. He was about 28 at the time, and very quiet, just the opposite of Master Sergeant Robert C. Bourgeois of New Orleans, our bombardier and the happiest-go-lucky fellow I have ever known. Sergeant Adam R. Williams, our engineer gunner, was from Virginia, so we all called him Hillbilly. I was co-pilot, just 9 months out of flying school. My last job on the Hornet before takeoff was to pass out lunches to the 16 B-25s. I saw to it that our crew got double. We loaded quickly and were guided into position after the number 12 crew took off. Mac gave the engine full throttle, watched the flagman give him the signal, and we blasted off the deck. We joined up with planes piloted by Greening and Bauer, who had taken off just ahead of us. Our 3-ship formation flew on all morning, about 25 feet above the water. I had not gotten a full breakfast aboard the carrier, so I snacked on sandwiches and oranges. Mac watched me eat, but would not join me. About noon we saw the Japanese coastline. But what part of the coast was it? We all checked our maps, but nothing seemed to match what we saw on the ground. "Think we are about 100 miles too far north," Campbell, our navigator, announced after long study. Mac immediately racked the Mitchell into a left turn. The navigators in the other planes must not have come to the same conclusion, although all three ships had the same target. Greening's ship turned right, while Bauer continued straight ahead. We wondered who was right, but since we had to maintain radio silence, we decided we were correct, and so continued down the coastline a few miles from shore. The water was full of fishing boats, thousands of them. We skimmed over their masts and could see Japanese fishermen going about their tasks. Some of them waved briefly. I took pictures with a little pocket camera. About 12:45 we came to a lighthouse which we identified on our maps as one east of Tokyo Bay. We turned right and almost immediately saw the bay ahead. But we were a little south of our intended course and flew over an airfield. Akak blasted at us immediately, so Mac hit the deck and dodged behind a hill. Campbell quickly checked his maps and said the Akak was a godsend because it enabled him to get a final accurate checkpoint before making our run over the target. Mac pushed the throttles ahead and we roared up to 1,500 feet straight out over the bay to the naval base. Bourgeois called for bomb doors open and then dropped a 500-pounder. Looking back, I saw a big ship loading crane fly into the sky and then break into 1,000 pieces. Bourgeois dropped 2 more 500-pounders. A floating dry dock in which a merchant ship was being converted into an aircraft carrier suddenly toppled onto its side like a toy boat in a bathtub. Nearby workshops exploded. It seemed like there were hundreds of the close-packed machine shops, so they also got our fourth and last explosive, a 500-pounder which broke apart into 120 incendiaries. I did not have much to do, so I put aside a sandwich, got out my camera, and took pictures. These have been widely used. They were the only combat photos to come out of the Tokyo raid. Other cameras either did not work, were forgotten, or got lost later. I guess that makes me the official Tokyo raid combat cameraman. When Bourgeois snapped the bomb doors shut, Mac made a sharp left turn and headed southeast back to sea to throw the Japanese off guard. 50 miles out, we swung southwest. We followed the Japanese coastline, rounded the southern tip of the islands, then headed due west for China. Because of headwinds, we never expected to make land. We figured we would run out of gas somewhere over the China Sea. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we ran into a heavy storm. It got dark early. We were lost in a fog and darkness. We kept flying straight ahead in and out of clouds, hoping it would soon clear up. I kept on eating. Might as well die happy, I told Mac. He did not think so. His mind was on the gas supply and the strong possibility of a night ditching at sea. I hope Columbus was right, and if you go far west, you get to the Far East, Bourgeois said over the interphone. Maybe we will come down in England, Williams said hopefully. About 10 in the evening, all 4 gas tanks registered empty. We went on for another 10 minutes. Mac turned on the automatic pilot and called us amidships, over the escape hatch. We are at 6,300 feet. Mac said, "If we jump quickly, we may be able to land together. Or drown together," I thought. Williams was to go first. We all said goodbye. I wish I had a picture of us. We had 5 long faces. Williams eased through the hatch. His head vanished, then popped up again. "Well, goodbye," he said. Again his head vanished, then up again. He grinned. "Well, goodbye," he said. "Goodbye for the last time," I said. I pretended I was going to step on his head. This time he went for good. Mac and I helped Bourgeois through the hatch, then Campbell. I squeezed into the hole. As I shoved downward, I could see Mac's feet coming after me. I let go and fell out into the fog and rain. Somewhere below was China or the China Sea. None of us knew which. 1001, I said after I dropped. I pulled the D-ring on the parachute. Nothing seemed to happen, and then there was a tremendous jerk. I pulled too soon and snagged the plane's tail, I thought. I was scared. But it was all over in a few seconds. I felt myself swinging back and forth in the rain. The chute was free after all. I was so happy to be alive, I forgot about where I might land. I drifted down silently through the clouds. I looked for the chutes of the other 4 men in the blackness, but could not see them. I shouted. Only the occasional swish of the silk canopy above me answered. The clouds parted. Below was the most welcome sight a man ever saw. 2 silver ribbons. They meant land. We had made China after all. A river and a wide highway, I thought. I reached up to spill the air from my canopy, and then, Bang! I hit the ground. I must have been only 50 feet or so above the ground when I saw the silver ribbons. Instead of being a wide river and a highway, they were two small creeks running along a rice paddy. I was in the field in 6 inches of mud and water. I could not complain, though. If I ever have to jump again, I will be grateful to have a rice paddy for a landing. I unsnapped my chute and hid it along a creek bank. It probably made its finder a rich man. My gun and belt had slipped off my hips when my chute snapped open. But over my shoulder I still had a bag with flashlight, extra ammunition, and first aid kit. I was wearing my flying coveralls and jacket. I dug out the light and flashed it, hoping to get an answer from my buddies. 7 lights answered. It did not take much of a mathematician to figure out that the 5 of us were not alone, so I put the light away. I started across the rice fields, stumbling through the mud. Every few feet there would be a little dirt ridge, and each time I came on one I would fall flat on my face in the muck. Within an hour I came to a river. I was tired and cold. I decided to try to sleep, but I was shivering so violently my head bounced up and down against the ground. Lying there, trying to keep myself from shaking apart, I saw a streak of light flash across the sky. Somebody signaling, I thought. I answered. The light came again, from downriver. I walked that way and saw a man walking on the other bank about 150 feet away. "Hey!" I shouted. The figure halted. "Hey!" I repeated a little louder. No answer. I tried a new turn. "Mac!" I shouted. "That you?" The answer was low, but was it ever welcome? It was McElroy. I started across the river, but the water was icy, cold, and waist deep, so I turned back. "Have to wait until morning," I told him. "Let us get some sleep." I found a stack of rice straw nearby, crawled into it, and pulled it over me. Fortunately, it was warm. I could hear Mac's teeth chattering clear across the river. Soon I was asleep. Mac said I snored something terrible. I woke up about dawn. A boat about 25 feet long, loaded with hay, was coming upstream. A man sat at the rudder. A boy about 10 years old was walking along the bank, pulling the heavy craft by a rope over his tiny shoulder. Boldly, I went toward them. I smiled. We had been told that if we landed in China, we should smile when we met inhabitants. If they grinned back, they were Japanese. If they smiled and bowed, they were Chinese. These two did neither. The man turned the boat out into the stream. The boy just bent over closer to the ground and pulled harder. I found a small boat under some weeds, kicked out a seatboard to use for an oar, and paddled over to Mac. A mile or two down the river we saw a village. We had no idea where the Japanese were, so Mac stayed a short distance from the cluster of huts while I approached. 30 or 40 men, women and children ganged around me, feeling my clothes and face. "Chiang Kai-shek," I said. It was the only thing I could think of. They all smiled and bowed. At least they are Chinese, I thought. Our instructions were to be calm, so I pulled out a cigarette lighter. As soon as I snapped it, the Chinese vanished, as though they had been blasted away. I waited, and one by one they came out of their huts. I kept flicking the lighter on and off. One man, bolder than the rest, came up. I gave him the lighter. It was our key to China. The man took me to his house with the village following. From a big teak food chest, he took out a map and studied it carefully. The room was packed with people. "Do you speak English or American?" a voice said. "Who said that?" I asked, startled. Everyone smiled and bowed. I went back to the map, thinking I was mistaken. Again came the voice. "Do you speak English or American?" I looked around quickly. Those in the room smiled. I thought maybe I was going out of my mind. Then I saw one little old man open his mouth and say, "Do you speak English or American?" I pushed through to him. "I am American," I said. "Say, am I glad you speak English?" He smiled and bowed. "Do you speak English or American?" he said again. Right then I realized that was all the English he knew. The man with the map was not much help either. I tried to ask him to locate the village on the map. Every time I pointed to a spot, he would nod and bow and smile. It was my introduction to the land of the perpetual yes. I do not believe I ever heard a Chinese say no all the time I was in China. I gave up hope of getting any information from my host when I discovered he was looking at the map upside down. Nobody in the village could show me where we were or where the Japanese were. I walked out of the hut and back to Mac. We headed down river. Then a youth, whom I shall always remember gratefully, ran out and grabbed my arm. He shook his head violently and pointed downstream. He imitated guns with his hands, just as we did when we were kids playing cops and robbers. Bang, bang, he said. He put his hands over his heart, made an awful face, and fell over backward in a heap. Must mean Japanese are that way, Max said. Later we learned Japanese soldiers were only 2 miles downstream. That boy probably saved our lives. We followed when the boy started off across a field. After a mile or so, we came upon a hut. A man in ragged coat and armed with a rifle jumped out and stood squarely in the path. On his lapel was a button which identified him as a soldier of China. He pointed his rifle at us and snapped the bolt into place. The boy shouted to him. He let us advance. I did not want to take any chances, so when I got close enough, I grabbed the sentry's rifle. The weapon almost came apart in my hands. The barrel was tied to the stock with a piece of string. I pulled the bolt open. The breech was empty. Mac and I still did not have the least idea where we were or where the Japanese were. The tattered soldier called a sergeant. The sergeant called a captain whom we could have hugged. He talked a little English and could read and write expertly. Captain Wong Nin was his name. He was commander of a nearby detachment and told us we were some 40 miles out of Poyang, which is about 100 miles northeast of Nanchang and 100 miles west of Chuchao, the base for which we were headed. Despite our early morning takeoff from the carrier, we had not only flown to our intended landing field but had actually overshot it, and for hours we had worried about coming down in the China Sea. We did not realize how lucky we were, however, until Captain Wong told us we had come down by parachute only 2 or 3 miles from Japanese lines. The two of us wondered what had become of our 3 buddies who jumped just before we did. Captain Wong led us to a village. He picked out the best house, which was not much of a place, and took over. He stripped off the doors and laid them on sawhorses for our beds. He went through the village, seizing blankets from beds and jammed them to his nose. Usually he would make a wry face and throw them down again. It took him quite a while to get an armload of blankets that did not smell too pungent for his American guests. Similarly, he went through the houses tasting soup. When he found some that suited him, Mac and I turned it down. I asked for some eggs. He brought me 3, and I boiled some water over a charcoal fire and cooked the eggs in it. We had tea to drink. It was by far the foulest stuff I have ever swallowed. I am sure the Chinese make tea once a year, then add dirty water the rest of the year. A man of 40 or so, whom I thought of as a boy, because all the Chinese were so small, coming only to my chest, and I am only an even 6 feet, took a shine to me. The captain said he wanted to wash my feet. I let him. Then I suggested he wash my shoes. He scrubbed them hard and placed them before the fire. Captain Wong and I sat up 3 hours talking while Mac dozed off. Before turning in on my doorbed, I tested my shoes to see if they were dry. The outsides were nice and dry, but the insides were small lakes. My energetic bootblack had set them before the fire filled to the top with water. We were eager to leave the next morning, but Captain Wong said to wait. 2 men were coming. A half-hour later, Sergeant Robert C. Bourgeois, our bombardier, and Sergeant Adam R. Williams, our engineer-gunner, walked in. Only Lieutenant Clayton J. Campbell, the navigator, was still missing, but the Chinese brought him in before the day was over. The 5 of us set out on small, shaggy ponies for Poyang, the nearest free China city. The ponies were so small our feet dragged on the ground, so I walked most of the way. We covered 10 miles that way, then stayed in another village. All the way 100 or more Chinese farmers followed us day and night. The following day we were promised big horses, which turned out to be sedan chairs. Captain Wong had a detachment of 100 soldiers who patrolled ridges on both sides of the route and also provided locomotion for the sedan chairs. When a carrier grew tired, the soldiers would run into the fields and impress farmers. Soon the grapevine spread the news and the farmers vanished, so the patrol would surround a village along the route and line up the men. Our captain would pick out the strongest and make them carry the chairs to the next village. I weighed twice as much as the Chinese and did not like to be carried by men no bigger than boys, so again I walked most of the way. We arrived outside Poyang late in the afternoon. There we were stopped, and for an hour or more we had to wait. Wong gave us no explanation. We could hear strange noises ahead growing louder,